Welcome back once again to the Pauper metagame. Today we're going to break down the perennial favorite, Mono Black Control. So Mono Black Control, according to MTG Goldfish, is about 2% of the metagame. Overall deck grade, C minus. I know some of you would probably throw rotten tomatoes and old eggs at me for insulting the stalwart Mono Black Control by giving it a C minus, but the deck is just kind of too dirtily. It has too many expensive cards. The deck rotates around a lot of 2 and 3 and more mana cards. 2, 3, and more, not 4, but yeah. Anyway, so let's go ahead and jump in here, talk a little bit about the composition of the decks, and then we'll move on and talk about some of the matchups. But before I get started with going through the actual deck components and the matchups and all that, I want to talk about two other things really quickly. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the online action role-playing game Path of Exile. Some of you, probably a lot of you by now, have heard of it, but if any of you haven't, I don't really have time to play it much these days, and I don't know why. Just on a random whim, I wanted to give it a shout out. If you ever played Diablo 2 or Diablo 3, Path of Exile is a game you're going to really enjoy, especially if you felt like Diablo 3 was a little too easy or just lacked enough depth, and you wanted to get back to something that felt more like Diablo 2 but was more challenging. Path of Exile is a great place to go. The other thing is it's totally free. It's one of the coolest games I've ever seen because it's free to play, and there's not really pay to win, which is really weird. It's very strange to find actual free to play games that are not pay to win. Path of Exile has not given me anything to promote their game. I've received no consideration whatsoever. I just really like the game, and maybe one of you out there will go try it out. You'll get to try it for free, and maybe you'll have fun, and maybe I just helped somebody out there to have some fun and have a good day. Anyway, moving right along, the next random thing I wanted to talk about is a little history about Mono Black Control. If we travel back in time about 9 years ago, when Pauper was just starting to take off as a format that was supported online. People played Pauper back before that, but we're going back to about the time when Magic Online started to host events within the Magic Online software that you could play in for tickets and get prizes and all that. Mono Black Control was one of the first tier 1, leading the pack kind of decks. So it's got a really storied history in the Pauper metagame. And I think it's a lot like Jund in Modern. There's a lot of people who should not be playing Jund in Modern right now because Jund is just too dirtily and the cards are too expensive for what they do, and there's just a lot of decks out there that run over Jund right now. But people have such fond memories of it. It's got a lot of grindy cards with good value. It's fun to play. It's a totally fair deck. And so probably a few too many people play Jund. Same thing happens with Mono Black Control. It's not that it's a terrible deck, it's just not what it used to be. A lot of the cards are just too expensive and don't provide enough punch. Having said that, some of the modern twists on the deck make it better. There's certain iterations of Mono Black Control these days that can make it better or worse depending. So anyway, with that in mind, with all those random shout outs and historical backtracking, let's actually jump into this list here. So this is I think representative enough. I like this particular list for our discussion purposes because it has a lot of different cards. Instead of having to look at a lot of different lists, we're going to be able to mostly just look at this list and talk about some of the different options that are included. Let's start out with the Kumba Witches. By the way, another random aside, if you're building physical Pauper decks, go pick up some Arabian Nights Kumbaj Witches. Unless I've missed another spike, they're still only about $5 a piece, so the fact that you can get a Pauper relevant Arabian Nights card that you can put in your deck and play for only, $4 or $5, I think that's pretty cool. I really, really enjoy that. And there's not too many old school cards you can pick up and jam in your deck and play with and have fun with that are both relatively cheap and important staples in a deck. So yeah, random tip, these these old Arabian Nights Kumba witches from Arabian Nights, they're not going to go down in price at any point. They've already been reprinted, so they're pretty much immune to reprint risk if you go get the originals. And it's just going to be a fun little piece of Magic history you can own, and they'll probably trail up to $10, $20 over the next few years. Anyway, Kumba Witches, 2 mana, 1/3, tap it, deal 1 damage to a creature or a player, and your opponent gets to also then do 1 damage to one of your creatures or to you, or they could even deal a damage to themselves if that somehow helps them in some fringe scenario. So what Kumba Witches do is they're good at picking off 1/1s, so it's reasonably good against Delver decks. And you know, there's pluses and minuses here. The red-blue Delver decks are going to have lightning bolts and screds, so Kumba Witches probably aren't going to last that long. Mono blue Delver has a lot of bounce effects, so they're probably going to just ship it back to your hand. But if you do manage to stick a Kumba Witch against the Delver deck, it's pretty good because it kills most of their creatures. It's also good against any random token decks or anything like elves. So Kumba Witches can be one of your best cards in your deck in some matchups. In other matchups, it's just going to be kind of blah. Against decks that have a lot of 2/2s that are attacking on the ground, the 1/3 body blocks reasonably well, so that's not nothing, I suppose. Also, it's got 2 black mana in the casting cost, which becomes relevant because most of these lists run 4 copies of Grey Merchant of Asphodel, which is a 5 mana 2/4. When it comes into play, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. So each black mana symbol that you have in play on your side of the board, it adds to your devotion to black. So for example, let's say you have a Kumba Witch and a Chittering Rats in play. So we can just count up our black mana symbols in play. We've got 1, 2 from the Kumba Witch, plus another 2 from the Chittering Rats. And then when the Grey Merchant comes into play, it also counts itself. So that's another 2 black mana symbols because it's 5 converted mana cost, 3 colorless, 2 black. So that's a total of 6 black mana symbols, which means you're going to dome your opponent for 6 damage. Actually, they lose life. It's not damage, so they can't use circles of protection to prevent it and that kind of thing, which is another bit of upside for the Grey Merchant. And you gain life, so this is also a good effect to have against something like Burn, if you can live long enough to actually drop your Grey Merchant onto the board. A lot of times you're going to be dead before you get to 5 mana, but you know, if you can make it, it can bail you out against Burn. Anyway, also Grey Merchant has 4 toughness, which is a pretty nice body for blocking purposes. And anyway, we'll backtrack here. Chittering Rats, 3 mana 2/2. When it comes into play, your opponent puts a card in their hand back on top of their library. This can be really annoying. Many of you have probably experienced this, but if your opponent is stumbling on mana, and somewhere around turn 3, it's not uncommon for your opponent to really need to hit a land drop, and they're really hoping to top deck a land, and then boom, you smack them with the Chittering Rats, and you know they effectively lose a card, and not only that, but it also bricks them from being able to top deck another land. So Chittering Rats can be pretty backbreaking. In you know weak scenarios, it just causes your opponent to go down a card in terms of the card advantage battle. Of course, in the very worst scenarios, if your opponent has no cards in hand, it's just a 3 mana 2/2, which is not great. However, in the best case scenarios where your opponent has issues, really needs to be able to draw a land, or they're flooding out and they need to draw some action, Chittering Rats can be backbreaking. Next up, Crypt Rats. I think this is an interesting include, and I like having a copy or 2 in the main deck. Good old Crypt Rats, 3 mana 1/1, pay X, and deal X damage to each creature and player. You can only spend black mana in this way. Very nice to have a board clearing option in the form of Crypt Rats. You can also dome your opponent to finish them off. Keep in mind, unlike the Grey Merchant, this is dealing damage, whereas Grey Merchant causes your opponent to lose life. So the Crypt Rat activated ability could be stopped by things like Circles of Protection and Prismatic Strands and those kind of things. Phyrexian Rager, 3 mana 2/2. When it comes into play, you lose a life and draw a card. Thorn of the Black Rose. I think in this day and age, you pretty much have to run at least a couple of copies of Thorn of the Black Rose to really be competitive. This is a 4 mana 1/3 with Death Touch. When it comes into play, you become the Monarch. And the Monarch token allows you to draw a card at the end of your turn. But if somebody deals combat damage to you, then they get the Monarch token, and you have to deal damage to them to get the Monarch token back. Most of you are probably familiar with this mechanic. The Death Touch is kind of nice. Having 3 toughness is also nice because that means you can kill attacking 2/2s, but they don't kill your Thorn unless they utilize some extra burn or pump or trick or something. We've got a copy of Gurmag Angler. This is tough. I kind of feel like 1 copy is fine. Maybe you want 2 copies. I don't know, but having that 5/5 for the delve is good, especially because the problem with mono black control is the gross mana inefficiency. So sprinkling in something like a Gurmag Angler that really increases your mana efficiency in the mid game is pretty good, but one of the problems for mono black is its lack of mana efficiency in the early game, so Gurmag Angler doesn't really help with that. So I don't know, maybe 1 copy is fine. I do like running at least 1 copy though, as it does help to add some extra mana efficiency, and the 5/5 body's not bad. I really like Unearth. I think that's extremely important because it gives you some versatile options in terms of being able to bring back, I guess I should explain what Unearth does first. Unearth is a 1 mana sorcery that allows you to return a creature from your graveyard back to play as long as that creature has converted mana cost 3 or less. You can also cycle it, so if you don't have anything in your graveyard, you can just cycle it out for 2 mana, which is kind of nice. But more times than not, you're going to be bringing back Chittering Rats, Kumbaj Witches, Crypt Rats, or Phyrexian Rager. You have a lot of different targets that can do different things at different times, and Unearth allows you to create some mana efficiency. For example, let's say you play Chittering Rats, your opponent bolts it off the board. Next turn, let's say you tick up to 4 mana and you're able to play a Phyrexian Rager, play Unearth, and also then bring a Chittering Rats back, getting off 2 spells in your 4th turn. That kind of thing is quite good and very helpful. Next up, we got Chainer's Edict. This is a pretty ubiquitous card in the metagame now. It's a 2 mana sorcery. Target player sacrifices a creature. You can flash it back for 7 mana. Echoing Decay is okay. I feel like this is good against tokens, and maybe it's not bad having a singleton copy in your deck. But I don't know. It's kind of weird because with only 1 copy, a lot of token decks are pretty fast, and you're not going to reliably hit this. So I don't know. I think maybe just having something like Disfigure, which is a 1 mana -2/-2, whereas Echoing Decay is a 2 mana -2/-2, but it also says target creature and all other creatures with the same name as that creature get -2/-2 until end of turn. So if your opponent has 7 1/1 goblin tokens, Echoing Decay can kill all of the tokens. Of course, if your opponent bolts the goblin token that you're targeting with Echoing Decay in response, you won't end up killing all the other tokens. So there's some tricks your opponents can utilize to get around Echoing Decay if they're able. Again, this is a card that can save your life, but because it costs 2 mana and the deck is so dirtily and struggles with having overcosted cards, something like Disfigure at a single mana can be an upgrade in this situation, perhaps. In this particular list, our opponent's running Deadweight, which is actually not bad. Deadweight, arguably in the current metagame, has some advantages over Disfigure because of the fact that you can stick a Deadweight on a Tireless Tribe and actually kill it, whereas your opponent can just pitch a card to a Tireless Tribe if you try to hit it with a Disfigure. So Tireless Tribe is the 1 mana 1/1 where it can discard a card to get +0/+4 and go up to 5 toughness, but only until end of turn. So if you play Disfigure, which is a 1 mana -2/-2 instant, they pitch a card in response and their Tireless Tribe becomes a 1/3 creature until end of turn. They untap next turn, their Tireless Tribe is fine, and then they inside out combo kill you the next turn. Versus if you can actually resolve Deadweight on the Tireless Tribe, since it's an enchantment, it's sticking around, and that means as soon as the turn ends, their Tireless Tribe is going to die. We've also got Geth's Verdict, which is a 2 mana target player sacrifices a creature and loses 1 life. This is fine. Having a little bit of extra sac effects is pretty good. I don't know about we've got 3 copies of Chainer's Edict here, 2 copies of Geth's Verdict. Frankly, I think you just go to 4 copies of Chainer's Edict and a singleton copy of the Geth's Verdict if you're going to do something like this. I know the instant speed is good, but I don't think it's so much better than the flashback that you get off the Chainer's Edict, my 2 cents. Got a couple of copies of Sign in Blood, 2 mana, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. This is pretty good. It definitely helps, especially because you really need to hit 3 mana for your deck to tick. So if you get stuck on 2 lands, Sign in Blood early can bail you out. Victim of Night, 2 mana, instant, destroy target non-werewolf, non-vampire, non-zombie creature. This is basically a kill most everything that's relevant out there. There are some zombie decks, so occasionally you will get bricked there, but the vast majority of the time, Victim of Night kills pretty much anything for 2 mana. Read the Bones is also pretty good. Now this is actually kind of tricky. Read the Bones is a 3 mana sorcery. It says scry 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. Now, in a vacuum, I think this is a better card than Sign in Blood. However, I don't think you should run Read the Bones in this type of mono black deck, the traditional mono black control list with, this creature package, some mishmash of the creatures we've talked about and removal and all that. For this reason, Read the Bones costs 3 mana and Sign in Blood costs 2 mana. Read the Bones is probably normally worth the extra mana, but you just have a ton of stuff in your deck that costs 3 and 4 mana, and you really need extra stuff in your deck that costs 1 and 2 mana to balance that out. So frankly, I would ditch this Read the Bones and go to 3 copies of Sign in Blood if I was going to run this deck list. Next up, we get into a very controversial and difficult card, Tendrils of Corruption. It's 4 mana instant. Tendrils of Corruption deals X damage to target creature and you gain X life, where X is the number of swamps you control. Now, the problem with Tendrils is it costs 4 mana for a removal card. It does gain you life, but it's very questionable whether or not this card is going to bail you out where you really need it to. Against something like Burn or really aggressive Goblin lists, you may or may not get to resolve this in a timely fashion where it's going to help then allow you to chain your way into casting a Grey Merchant of Asphodel. It is going to cause you to lose some games because it's 4 mana, and again, your deck is so clunky. Tendrils can win you matches, it can lose you matches. If I was going to run it, I'd probably keep it to a singleton copy because I would want to have more copies of cheaper removal that I could get on board faster to make sure that I'm going to stay competitive and stay alive. So yeah, I don't know, but hey, your mileage may vary. Feel free to try out Tendrils, see if you like it. I will say back in the day, Tendrils was an absolute boss card, but back in the good old days, people used to also run Corrupt. I think it was Corrupt or Corruption. Let me see if we can take a little detour real quick and look that up. I think it's Corrupt. Let's see. Oh, okay, yeah, it's Corrupt. So Corrupt is basically a 6 mana sorcery which deals damage equal to the number of swamps you control to target creature or player, and then you gain life equal to damage dealt this way. So you could use it as like a late game finisher, but it's 6 mana, and that's just too slow in today's more advanced Pauper metagame. Got a singleton copy of Pestilence. I kind of like this, but the tricky question is Pestilence versus Crypt Rat, because you can unearth a Crypt Rat. You cannot unearth a Pestilence. However, Pestilence plus a Gurmag Angler or a Grey Merchant of Asphodel can be a hard lock against certain matchups. So I don't hate having a single copy of Pestilence. That might actually be just fine. I kind of want to have another copy of Crypt Rats, but because this particular list has 2 more copies in the sideboard, that's probably just fine. I mean, that's probably totally justifiable. I will say I like the 4 copies of Barrenmoor. I'm okay with 23 lands. I think you might need 24 lands. I would probably drop a copy of Tendrils of Corruption to get up to 24 land. Again, you don't have a lot of 1-drops or 1 casting cost spells in your deck. You've got a few 2 casting costs and just tons of 3 casting cost things. So based on that, I want to have 24 lands. I should also mention that Mono Black Control typically runs a copy or 2 of Oubliette, which is a 3 mana, 2 black, 1 colorless enchantment that basically exiles a creature for as long as Oubliette remains in play, and it also exiles the enchantments that are on that creature. So where this becomes relevant is if your opponent has maybe your opponent's playing Stompy, they got an elf out with a Rancor, the Oubliette will actually deal with the creature and the Rancor, which is kind of nice. But it is 3 mana removal, so there is a trade-off there. Also, if you're going to build this deck in real life in paper, Oubliette is like a $25-$30 card or some absurdity like that. So you also have to factor in if you really want to pay for that. One of the things I would change here though is I would run at least 2, maybe even get greedy and go for 3 copies of Bojuka Bog and swap out some swamps for those. They do come into play tapped, but again, you don't really have a lot of things you're doing on turn 1 and turn 2. And having main deck access to exiling your opponent's graveyard, I feel like is very powerful, and you're getting it at a fairly low cost. Because again, your spells are so expensive anyway. Most of the time, you're going to be able to work in dropping a tapped Bojuka Bog. You're not an aggressive deck. You don't have to worry about making sure your first 2 land drops are untapped. So I would want more Bojuka Bogs. Next up, disfigures in the sideboard. I think this is a little odd. I think I'd rather start out with these in the main and then have other things in the sideboard. I like disfigure better in the main with something like tendrils coming out of the sideboard. 3 duress is pretty good. Also, they're running the Hill Spellbomb. I like the idea of just having more main deck Bojuka Bogs, because then I could probably get away with dropping 1 or both of these Nil Spellbombs from the sideboard and you know, picking up something else. Raven's Crime's really sweet. I don't feel like enough people run this card. It's just really good. 1 mana sorcery, target player discards a card and has retrace. This is a lot of fun because you can turn your lands into a weapon against your opponent. It mitigates your flooding, and later on in the game, if you get ahead, it can make it really hard for your opponent to come back, because if your opponent cannot keep a hand together, they're going to have a hard time getting back in the game. Another copy of Geth's Verdict seems completely justifiable, especially if you just want to have a little more action against Boggles. Shrivel, good against Elves, good against Boggles, good against Delvers and Fairies and things. Crypt Rats, good against a lot of swarmy decks. Reaping the Graves, good against a lot of these decks out there that are going to try to go long. Okiba Gang Shinobi is a lot of fun. It's a 5 mana 3/2 that has ninjutsu for 4. And whenever Okiba Gang Shinobi deals combat damage to a player, that player discards 2 cards. So you do something like attack with a Chittering Rats. Well, turn 3, play Chittering Rats. Turn 4, make your 4th land drop, attack with your Chittering Rats, and then ninjutsu in your Okiba Gang Shinobi to dome your opponent, make them discard 2 cards. And now you've also returned your Chittering Rats so that you can recast the Chittering Rats the next turn and further card disadvantage your opponent. This is, something like that is sort of living the dream. If you're going up against a heavy control deck, there's a reasonable chance your opponent's going to keep your board so cleared off that you don't get a chance to ninjutsu in your Okiba Gang Shinobi. But if you do manage it, it's going to be sweet. So what I would probably like to have, maybe your matchup against Tron is not going to be great, so it might be worth having access to maybe a couple of land destruction spells out of the sideboard, or if you don't really want to worry about that angle, maybe even having an extra Raven's Crime or a little bit extra discard, maybe a Wrench the Mind, which is a 2 mana sorcery, causes your opponent to discard 2 cards unless they discard an artifact. However, one of the matchups you really want to bring that card in against is Tron, and they have a lot of artifacts, so you definitely lose some value there. I don't know. It's mostly just you need to have a mixture of discard and removal coming out of your sideboard. So when you're up against creature-based decks, you've got more removal you can bring in, and when you're being able to more tailor your removal options. When you're going up against more controlling and mid-range decks, you need to have access to some more grindy options like these Okiba Gang Shinobis and Reaping the Graves and Raven's Crime and Duress, these kind of things. So that's basically the deck. Very quickly, as far as matchups go, against Delver decks, it's okay if you can live, but your stuff is just so dirtily and expensive. A lot of time Delver's gonna get out ahead of you and do you dirty, especially if you don't have enough 1 mana removal spells so that you can be able to fire off a removal spell on your first land drop a fairly consistent amount of time, or be able to fire off 2 removal spells on turn 3, this kind of stuff. If you can't do that very well, and the list we just looked at really couldn't, Is it Delver and Mono Blue Delver are just going to give you fits. Against Burn, you're generally too slow to get your life gain going. Burn's going to kill you too quickly. Against Tron, the Tron lists tend to grind better than you do, so you're going to lose there. Against Boros, a lot of times they've got enough life gain to sort of outrun the damage your gray merchants will do while putting up enough pressure and also having enough removal that they're going to battle with you pretty well. I actually think the edge is with Boros, but it's a lot closer of a matchup than I think these other matchups are we just discussed. I like your matchup against Elves just because you're going to have typically a fair bit of mass removal between Chittering Rats, Pestilence, and then other options out of the sideboard like Nausea, which gives everything -1/-1. Against Inside Out Combo, you have a lot of removal, so you can actually put up give them a pretty good bit of grief because you have a lot of edict effects and things like that. You are kind of dirtily, so sometimes they can get out and kill you faster than you can respond. Another reason again where having more cheap removal fast is important. Is it Blitz? Same kind of thing as Inside Out Combo. You're going to be able to blow them out a fair amount of the time. Your matchup's probably even a little bit better against these Is It Blitz decks because their cheapest best combo creature costs 2 mana, whereas Inside Out Combo can theoretically play their creature on turn 1 and combo you on turn 2. It doesn't happen very often, but they can. Whereas Is It Blitz can't combo you until turn 3. And that's enough of a difference that it's going to make a big difference in the matchup. You probably have a pretty good matchup against Is It Blitz. Against Blue-Black Control, they're probably going to grind a little better than you, but not as much as Tron. So post-sideboard, you can probably make it sort of a 50-50 matchup, maybe, but I still think Blue-Black Control's favored overall in the matchup. Against Affinity, you've got like an okay, maybe 50-50 matchup because you have a lot of solid removal. Against Boggles, you probably have the edge because you have a fair bit of sweepers and edict effects. Against Stompy, you probably also again have the edge. Against Mono Blue Delver, you're a little bit of a dog. And so as you can see, Mono Black Control, in my opinion, is just not excellently matched up against a lot of the upper tier decks. It basically oscillates between having bad matchups and okay matchups. And that's just usually not where you want to be. You want to be on a deck that has a lot of good matchups and maybe a few bad matchups. Or you have very reasonable 50-50 matchups against everything. And that unfortunately for Mono Black Control is just not where it is these days. But you know what? It's an old school deck that's an important part of the history of Pauper. It's a fun, fair deck. And if you're building something like a battle box of Pauper decks, you got to include Mono Black Control. It's too much just a part of what has made Pauper to leave it out, in my opinion. So if you've played it before, now's not the time to play it. If you've never taken Mono Black for a spin, well, take it out and give it a try. It's kind of a fun deck. It can be frustrated when you get stuck on 2 lands, but if you follow some of my advice in terms of trying to keep ditch some of those more expensive dirtily cards and have a few more cheap removal spells, and if you're going to have extra supplemental card draw, just stick to the Sign and Bloods because they cost 2 mana. If you do things like that, you can make the deck a little more palatable. Anyway, that's all for today. I hope for those of you out jamming the leagues, I hope you're able to pile up fat stacks of tickets and have a great time until we see you next time on the Pauper Metagame. Peace!